We begin now with a look at Unit 2, Colonial Society and the Coming of the American Revolution. During the late 17th and into the 18th centuries, that's the 1600s and into the 1700s, the population of the American colonies was growing fairly rapidly. They were still very dependent on immigration from Europe, primarily England, but with families flourishing, especially in New England, populations were also growing naturally. Many of the immigrants who arrived from England came as indentured servants, although after the 1670s this did begin to change. A decrease in the English birth rate, partly due to unemployment and starvation in England, meant there was a smaller population and therefore less people seeking servitude. This was partly responsible for the shift to slavery as a primary labor force, particularly in the southern colonies, although slavery was allowed and present in all of the colonies. Once those who did come to the colonies actually got here, they tended to have larger families than they would have in England, especially those living on farms. Children on farms were expected to provide the labor that the farm needed, and they could lend a hand in the fields almost from the time they could walk. Because land was so plentiful, once those children grew up, they would be able to find new land for themselves if need be. Plus, land could be divided amongst all of the children, as laws of primogeniture did not apply. Over time, natural birth became a leading source of population increase. One of the reasons why it took time is because women had been scarce at first, and high death rates in the colonies due to disease, malnutrition, and even poor water quality had contributed to the desperate need for immigrants. But as conditions improved and the white population increased, it would eventually surpass that of the native population, and the British colonies would be the fastest growing colonies of the European powers in the New World. Overall, in the colonies, men heavily outnumbered women at first, but by the mid-18th century, the gender ratio rivaled that of England itself, with women holding a slight majority. Women in the colonies could expect to run their households, taking care of basically all the domestic chores, and could expect to have a child approximately every 2 years, starting from the time they got married until they reached menopause or died. Women had an average of 8 children, and especially in the southern colonies, it would be expected that 5 of them would die in infancy or early childhood. More would reach adulthood in the northern colonies, and because of longer life expectancies there, up to 70 years of age, it was not uncommon for a dozen children or more to be born to one mother. Interestingly, despite the power that religion had over people's lives, over 1/3 of marriages, particularly in the Chesapeake region, occurred with the bride already pregnant. It occurred, though was much less likely in the northern colonies. Family and social life in the northern colonies, particularly England, was much more stable and more traditional. Families tended to immigrate together, and gender ratios there were more balanced even right from the beginning. The New England colonies in particular tended to have exceptional lifespans, with an average life expectancy of around 60 to 70 years. One of the reasons for this was a much cooler climate, which led to less disease, as well as access to clean, uncontaminated drinking water. With this stability and increased life expectancy, there wasn't really as much rush to marry and have children, so women tended to marry a little bit later than their southern counterparts, often not until their early 20s. Still, women were usually younger than their husbands by a significant degree, and often outlived them. But since this widowhood was occurring later in life, when children were grown, they were actually less likely to remarry. Marriages in Europe were more like business arrangements and frequently arranged by a girl's father, usually with her input, but not always. But in the colonies, this tendency was decreasing, though parental approval was still usually necessary. Getting married was a societal expectation, so it was rare to have unmarried women, unless they were a widow, although it did occasionally happen to a younger woman if a girl was caring for a sick family member. Women in New England society were particularly expected to be modest and submissive, and you can see this with the choice of names that families gave for their daughters, especially those of the Puritan faith, with popular names including Prudence, Chastity, Patience, and Comfort, reflecting some of the ideals that they hoped these girls could live up to. In the South, living conditions were not nearly as good, and therefore the population remained stunted in comparison to the North for some time. Men also dramatically outnumbered women, making it unlikely that a woman would ever go unmarried at all, especially in the early years. The climate and increased likelihood of disease also led to a reduction in the average life expectancy over what even England was, to an average of just about 40 years in the Chesapeake, and it was about 50 in England. This made it imperative that women marry as soon as possible, most of them in their mid-teens. Like in the North, there was a significant gap in the ages between a husband and a wife, with 10 years being quite common, which would mean that it was very common for women to outlive their husbands, and thus they could inherit or control their husband's estate when he died. While she typically did not inherit in her own right, she could often control the estate until either her own death or remarriage, or until her children came of age. And since when a widow with very young children, since that was quite common, remarriage was also very common, and thus you had complicated family relationships where there could be numerous step-siblings and half-siblings. With women in control of many of the large landed estates, they would be able to exercise considerable influence, sometimes even in the political arena, although they could never vote. But over time, as the gender ratio balanced out and natural reproduction became a major source of population increase, the traditional patterns of male authority would revive even in those southern colonies. The colonial economy was quite a bit different than that in England, and also it depended heavily on where you lived. Particularly in the Chesapeake, tobacco cultivation was the basis for the economy, and its cultivation followed a boom and bust cycle of development. Tobacco was often overproduced when supply would exceed demand, and so crop prices would plummet. That's the bust cycle. And then, with scarcity, because farmers would find other things to make an income with, prices would increase and the cycle would repeat. Nevertheless, large plantations continued to develop slave labor to grow crops, cash crops like tobacco. The Carolinas and Georgia, you also had cash crop production, but it was focused on rice and indigo. Having this large demand for cash crops and the development of large plantations to grow it on would stifle the development of large-scale cities and even really to some extent a lot of trade. The existence of large navigable rivers also meant that ocean-going ships could travel to individual plantations, which had their own docks, so there really wasn't a need for many large-scale cities. In the north, agriculture was still dominant. However, hard rocky soil made it so that northerners had to develop other commercial interests as well. So you had a thriving commercial class, and naturally cities grew out of this venture. There was also the lack of large navigable rivers in many locations, and the presence of natural harbors, which stimulated the growth of cities. Now, the middle colonies kind of had the best of both worlds. They would grow to become the primary producers of grains, especially wheat, oats, barley, and corn. But there was also a demand for markets for natural resources that they possessed, and so you saw the development of timber, mining, and fishing industries. And of course, with the fishing industry, it needed ships, and timber was needed to build those ships, so the colonies developed a thriving shipbuilding industry in the region as well. You had some small-scale production of goods that existed in the colonies, but for the most part, the colonies supplied England with raw material, and England supplied the colonies with finished goods. Much colonial trade existed with England. Raw materials and agricultural commodities and foodstuffs were shipped to England, and in exchange, various types of manufactured products and textiles, furniture, and even something as simple as wine would be returned back. After the 1660s, to protect English farmers and fishermen, high taxes were imposed on certain colonial products that were to be exported. Of course, the cash crops, timber, fur, and even whale oil were exempted from those taxes because those products were in great demand in England itself, and sometimes could not be produced there. Eventually, the colonies, particularly New England, would begin trading with foreign ports all across the globe. In what we call the triangular trade, one particular trade route, New Englanders would ship rum to the west coast of Africa, where it was traded for slaves, who were then shipped to the West Indies, where they would be working on the sugar plantation. And those slaves would be sold in exchange for molasses, a product of sugar cane, which was then shipped back to the colonies, especially New England, where it would be manufactured into more rum, and so the cycle would begin again. Now, this wasn't the only triangular trade route, but it is definitely the most well known. Religion is also a significant force in the lives of the colonists, with many of the earliest settlers having come from England because of religious persecution. Catholics, Quakers, and even Puritans hoped to find a place to worship freely in the colonies, and they did. But over time, religious fervor had decreased, and survival had occupied most people's attention, as there wasn't the restrictions on religion or the discrimination that they had faced in England. In the 1660s, in New England, ministers who were troubled by the lack of conversions and the declining church membership tried to come up with something new with regards to the Congregationalist church. And they came up with what was known as the halfway covenant, a way for individuals to have their children baptized and effectively grow the numbers of people in the religion without the parents first having undergone a full conversion and therefore full church membership themselves. Still, the waning interest in religion was decreasing church membership, and by the 1730s, this is going to start to change. A new revival began, starting with Jonathan Edwards in Massachusetts, who, although from Puritan roots, emphasized a personal experience in an individual's relationship with God. The revival came to be known as the Great Awakening. Edwards' message centered around the ideas that humans were sinners and God was an angry judge, and individuals needed to ask him for forgiveness. He also preached justification by faith alone, a dramatic departure from Puritan teachings. In 1741, Edwards gave an infamous and highly emotional sermon that has come to be called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. News of his message, news of his ideas spread quickly throughout the colonies, and soon other ministers were joining in with and even expanding on the idea, including George Whitefield, who would travel more than 5,000 miles, giving over 350 sermons to people up and down the Atlantic coast. Whitefield preached to common people, to slaves, even to Native Americans. No one was out of reach. Whitefield's success convinced many English colonists to join local churches, not just his own church, but a variety of denominations saw this revival, re-energizing a once waning Christian faith. Some of the basic themes that were addressed in this Great Awakening, regardless of specific denomination, were that all people were born as sinners, and sin without salvation would send a person to hell. All people, though, could be saved if they confessed their sins to God and sought his forgiveness. Everyone could have a direct and emotional connection with God. It didn't have to be formal and institutionalized. The relationship could be casual and personal. But of course, this was very different and caused a schism within some of the churches, especially the Congregational church in New England. Those that embraced the new thinking would be dubbed the New Lights, and those that did not, the Old Lights. Eventually, those New Lights would branch out, founding various new Protestant denominations. After about 20 years, though, this Great Awakening had come to an end. But in the 1790s, another religious revival, the Second Great Awakening, would begin in about the same area.